1, 2, 3, 4.
That I don't need a lot of time behind. But I control the timer. Yeah, that works.
Convenient couch situation.
You're right over there. All right. Sorry, Walter. I think we're going to get going. All right?
Hi, Susan Delbene.
Okay, the committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Congressional Reforms of the Past and Their Effect on Today's Congress. And to start off, I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes to give a far less than 5-minute opening statement. First, I'd like to thank, in her absence, Chairwoman Lofgren for allowing us to use this beautiful committee room. So this weekend, I was in my car with my iPhone on shuffle, listening to music when the phenomenal Talking Heads song Once in a Lifetime came on. And in it, David Byrne famously asks, you may ask yourself, how did I get here? And it struck me that soundtrack could be that song could be a good soundtrack to this hearing. I think a lot of our constituents are asking the exact same question of us. How did Congress get here? Where and how have things gotten so far off the rails that Congress is not fulfilling its obligations to its bosses, the American people? And today we're going to hear from 5 experts who I will introduce after opening statement from my friend across the aisle. But today we're going to hear from 5 experts who have extensively studied and in some case participated in some of the past reform efforts and who I hope can help us better understand how Congress got here. They've got perspectives on why some changes were made and why some weren't. They've got perspectives on why some reforms were adopted immediately and some gradually over time. They've got perspectives on what made some reform efforts successful and others fail. And they've got ideas that we can noodle on as a committee as we just start defining what success looks like for this committee. So in my personal view, part of what ails Congress is that we do too much talking and not enough listening. So with that in mind, I'm going to wrap it up so we can hear from these terrific experts. But before I do, let me recognize Mr. Woodall for 5 minutes to make opening remarks in the absence of our Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to put away 4.5 of those minutes with that introduction of let's do more listening than talking. I would point out, though, looking at most of the faces on the panel, it's not a function of how did we get here. Most of these folks helped to guide us in getting here. From my freshman orientation class, which the Congressional Institute did, my young days as a congressional staffer when Don Wolfensberger was doing his young days as a Rules Committee staff director. Walter was also young in those days, and we were all reading the same reports then, trying to figure out how we could do better tomorrow than we did yesterday. So I'm looking forward to this panel, and I want you to know, sitting in the Republican cloakroom today, Mr. Chairman, we were talking about what our prospects were across this Congress over the next 20 months. And someone spoke up and said, I'm really excited about that project that Derek Kilmer's working on there, and he's been reaching out, and he's been talking, and he's been making himself available to folks on both sides of the aisle from day one. So I want to thank you for that leadership. It's going to yield great results.
Thanks. From your lips to God's ears. Today, we welcome the testimony of our 5 witnesses, who I will introduce quickly. First, we have Dr. John Lawrence, who spent 38 years as a senior congressional staff member, the last 8 as chief of staff to Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Since 2013, Dr. Lawrence has been a visiting professor at the University of California's Washington Center. He blogs on national politics and Congress at Domocracy, speaks widely on current political issues and trends, and has published in the New York Times, Politico Magazine, and The Atlantic. Dr. Lawrence is the author of The Class of '74, Congress After Watergate and the Roots of Partisanship, which chronicles the Watergate babies, the large group of Democrats elected to the House of Representatives in the aftermath of Watergate, including the reforms they helped implement and how these efforts to modernize Congress combined with a changing political environment to lay the groundwork for today's political atmosphere. So welcome, Dr. Lawrence. Second, we have Walter Olezek, who is a senior specialist in American national government at the Congressional Research Service. In 1993, he served as policy director of the Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress. Mr. Olezek is an adjunct professor of political science at American University and a frequent lecturer on political affairs. He's the author of several books, including Congressional Procedures and the Policy Process and Congress Under Fire, Reform Politics, and the Republican Majority. Page Turners. Next, we have Molly Reynolds, a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings. Ms. Reynolds studies Congress with an emphasis on how congressional rules and procedure affect domestic policy outcomes. Ms. Reynolds is also the author of the book Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate, which explores creation, use, and consequences of the budget reconciliation process and other procedures that prevent filibusters in the U.S. Senate. Her current research projects include work on the congressional budget process, especially the consequences of broader partisan dynamics on the consideration of the yearly budget resolution and appropriations bills, and on the consequences of federalism for national policymaking in the current period of what was the period of unified Republican Party control. Ms. Reynolds also supervises the maintenance of vital statistics on Congress, Brookings' long-running resource on the first branch of government. So welcome, Ms. Reynolds. And next we welcome Mark Strand, who served as president of the Congressional Institute since 2007. Founded in 1987, the Congressional Institute is a not-for-profit corporation dedicated to helping members of Congress better serve their constituents and helping their constituents better understand the operations of the national legislature. Mr. Strand spent nearly 24 years on Capitol Hill in both the House and the Senate, most recently serving as Chief of Staff to former Senator James Talent from Missouri. He served as the staff director of the House Committee on Small Business when Mr. Talent was chairman. He was also Chief of Staff for Representatives Bill Lowry from California, Stan Paris from Virginia, and Mr. Strand regularly speaks to organizations about how Congress works or doesn't. Besides speaking and lecturing on legislative politics, he teaches courses on surviving inside Congress. Please sign me up, sir. And last but not least, we have Donald Wolfensberger, the director of the Congress Project at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Mr. Wolfensberger is the author of the book Congress and the People, Deliberative Democracy on Trial. He spent 28 years as staff member in the House of Representatives, beginning as legislative assistant to Representative John Anderson of Illinois. Mr. Wolfensberger joined the House Rules Committee staff as Anderson's subcommittee counsel in 1979, and then subsequently served on the committee as subcommittee counsel to Representative Trent Lott and then Representative Lynn Martin. In 1991, he was named Republican Staff Director of the Rules Committee, and in 1995 was named Chief of Staff. He's an expert on parliamentary rules and procedures and played a key role in developing House reform proposals for the Republican leadership over the years. And Mr. Wolfensberger, we welcome you as well. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. And Dr. Lawrence, before I turn it to you, I do want to just thank Chairwoman Lofgren for the use of your beautiful committee room and for your terrific partnership in helping our committee get set up and running. And now, Dr. Lawrence, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Thank you.
The question is how well and what your goals are. One point that I want to make very emphatically is that I know that efficiency is always looked upon as an objective, but there is a downside to efficiency in a large legislative operation. There's always an inherent tension between the desire for efficient operation and the ability for members to fully participate and buy into the legislative deliberations. Third, I want to say that all reforms carry with them unintended consequences, and it's best to keep that in mind. And fourth, we need to be realistic in our expectations about what modernization and what reform can accomplish. In the book that I wrote on the class of '74, I talk about some of the more successful efforts that were made in the mid-1970s by that class and other reformers, and there certainly were other efforts at around the same time, the Hansen and the Bowling, Patterson commissions, the Hamilton-Gradison Commission in 92. Those ended in failure. So there's a lot to be learned as to what is successful and what is not. A first step is to agree on the objective. Mo Udall once said, we tend to overkill when we get involved in some of these reform things in the House. So keeping in mind what the objective is key. Efficiency is desirable, but we also know that deeply woven into the fabric of American government is the fact that the legislative process, the design of government itself, is not a very efficient process, and some inefficiency is desirable because it allows people to fully participate. We also know that well-intended reforms can go awry. One of the reforms in the '70s was allowing people to offer more amendments through open rules on the floor, and your former colleague Leo Ryan said many of those amendments were designed to stall, to delay, to make things not happen, to embarrass opponents. So simply opening rules turned out not to be always the best idea. Some reforms have actually contributed to today's polarized environment. You look at the decision to televise in the 1970s, David Dennis, an Indiana representative at that point, said, you better be careful, it's going to turn the members of Congress into prima donnas. Fortunately, that hasn't happened, but what has happened over that period of time is that clearly the level of partisan rhetoric and accusatory rhetoric has really escalated. 35 years ago, Tip O'Neill's words were taken down when he called Newt Gingrich's comments the lowest thing I've ever seen in his career. Today, such a comment would barely even merit a notice on the House floor. Other important reforms, however, of the 1970s really were very effective in terms of restoring power to the general membership, to expand staffing on budgets to subcommittees, both chairmen and minorities alike, expanding the number of recorded votes to improve accountability. Reformers of every era have tried to take politics out of politics, and that, as my old boss George Miller used to say, is a fool's errand. So long as the parties are locked in rough parity and in constant battle for control with grave consequences stemming from victory or loss, even well-intended reforms may fail to achieve the goal of a more collaborative Congress, but I have a few suggestions. One is, I would suggest that you really seriously think about toughening the rules on what constitutes appropriate floor speech. You might even consider restricting or even ending 1 minute and special orders in order to reserve the House for serious substantive legislative debate. Secondly, I think all of us will probably agree you have to return to something more along the lines of regular order to enable people to take part in full committee deliberations. Lastly, I would suggest that we think about ways to ensure that legislation that enjoys very broad public support has a mechanism for reaching the floor, perhaps even through some sort of non-public discharge petition that allows members to sign up with an independent source, such as the parliamentarian or the Comptroller General, because I think the general public loses confidence in the institution when they see issues that enjoy broad bipartisan support and yet they don't receive any attention from the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Olezek.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, and members of the Select Committee. It's certainly a privilege to have the opportunity to testify. I think I've been invited because of my past experience working for a number of reform initiatives. You can see with what results sometimes. But anyway, what I want to do is just three things. I want to talk briefly about the word reform, and then I want to talk about context, which I think is fundamental to the success or failure of of this kind of organized effort. And maybe talk about, if I, in a few moments we have, to talk about some of the elements that are universal almost to all legislative reform elements. Now, in terms of the word reform, or you could also substitute for it reorganization or modernization, that people like that word. You have tax reform, lobby reform, campaign finance reform, because it implies a change for the better. Now, whether or not something is a change for the better is often in the eye of the beholder, because sometimes one group's or person's reform is another person's deform, if you will, because of the consequences that impact on a party or a group or an individual. I brought along a statement made by, long ago actually, but in 1965, 66, by former Republican Minority Leader Gerald Ford, later President of the United States, that I think is useful to bear in mind, because you're going to be inundated, as you already are, with hundreds, if not more, really, probably, of proposals for change. And it's a matter of how you evaluate and sift through these changes to come up with what you think is a saleable package to your members and actually will produce a result. And sometimes the result is very difficult to achieve. But what Jerry Ford had to say was this, and I quote, "Reform is a tricky word. Change, per se, is not necessarily the same as progress. Each and every proposal for change must be weighed against other suggested reforms, and all must be weighed in the balance of power between the branches of the government." I guess that's enough I want to say on reform. In terms of context, what I refer to there is really the conditions and circumstances in play at the time that facilitate progress on reform. And you combine that with leadership and you can get a positive outcome, hopefully. In 1945, the conditions were ripe, just as they are, in my estimation, today. You know, you had a lot of lawmakers who were familiar with the collapse of democracies in Europe. You had the World War II, the escalation of power to the president in a New Deal, and any war centralizes power in the presidency. And you had a whole bunch of outside groups as well who were very interested in congressional reform. And so you had this combination that led to the enactment of, the Legislative Reorganization Act in 1946, the first major Legislative Reorganization Act in Congress's history. And those are, I'm just going to focus on two other joint committees and then move on to these final elements. I'm watching the clock. And you also had champions of reform as well, inside and outside, members who were strong on it. 65 Joint Committee, you had the same conditions in play. A lot of the members at that time said, hey, you didn't go far enough in 1946. There are new problems that emerged. Society has changed. And so you had lawmakers like Richard Bowling write a book, Representative Bowling from Missouri, House Out of Order. Over in the Senate, you had a senator named Joseph Clark who wrote a book called Congress, the Sapless Branch. And that indicated the tenor of the times. And so you had the 65 Reorganization Act enacted. And we can go talk about what that all did. And then the 93 one that I was the policy director of, as Mr. Chairman indicated, and that was a tough one. That got started largely because of scandals, to be blunt. And it had a rough go. It was bipartisan. They came up with a big package. It never went anywhere, in part because of partisan splits in the chamber at large. And so... And the surprise was, in terms of unexpected consequences, what happened was David Dreyer, the Republican of California, the vice chair of the Joint Committee, later Rules Committee chair, was designated by Newt Gingrich. You come up with a package of reforms. And what did he look to in part was the Joint Committee's plan. And so he picked up a lot of ideas from the Joint Committee, and they became part of the rules of the House of Representatives. And in fact, one of them, even though it was around before, Congressional Accountability Act, made it into law.
Thank you. You stuck the landing. Thank you. Ms. Reynolds.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today about past efforts to reform congressional staffing and the lessons that we should draw from that history. I'm going to make 3 points today about the history of reforms in this particular area, which is one of several that the committee is charged with examining. First, lawmakers have long debated and disagreed about how Congress should be staffed. Second, past episodes of reforming congressional staffing often reveal competing and conflicting goals. And third, Congress's decisions about necessary staffing resources cannot be separated from the politics that shaped them. Since the early 20th century, calls for reform from both on and off Capitol Hill have echoed similar themes. First, Congress lacks the resources to deal with its workload and the complexity of the problems it must solve. And second, Congress lacks sufficient capacity to oversee the executive branch. These issues have been raised during every major effort to reform Congress. Reformers, however, have not always prescribed more staff to meet these challenges. In the early 1940s, some reformers doubted that congressional committees should have their own expert staffs, arguing that doing so would set up conflicts with the executive branch. After a period of significant growth in staff levels during the 1970s and 1980s, some scholars observed that the prominence of unelected congressional staff could have both positive and negative consequences. The recommendations of the 1992-93 Joint Committee called for reductions in the overall size of the legislative branch staff, arguing that, quote, Congress cannot exclude itself from efforts to make staffing structures and organizations more rational, efficient, and cost-effective. Previous debates have also revealed competing views about the control and purpose of congressional staff. First, who should control the selection and deployment of congressional staff? The ability to personally select his or her own staff according to his or her own preferred criteria has long been seen as a central prerogative of members. But other reformers argue that the institution as a whole could benefit from a more regularized system of positions and pay, as well as consistency in the applicability of certain policies across offices. Second, who should decide how to deploy staff? Committee staff are generally viewed as a key source of substantive expertise for the policymaking process, but Congress has frequently debated how to balance the need for expertise with long-standing practices that allow the majority party to control the majority of the committee's resources. Members have also differed in their assessments of the potential value of nonpartisan staff. We also see competing views about the use of staff within members' own offices. The freedom given to members about how to allocate their fixed staffing resources to accomplish their wide range of goals has led to greater numbers of staff members based in the states and districts. In 1979, roughly a third of member staff was based in the congressional districts. Today, that proportion has risen to just under half, peaking at about half in 2004 and 2005. These non-DC-based staff tend to be caseworkers, constituent service representatives, grants coordinators, field representatives, and community outreach specialists. Assisting constituents with an increasingly complex federal bureaucracy is an important part of a representative's job, but these functions do not directly enhance Congress's legislative capacity. The current staffing landscape on Capitol Hill results from a series of discrete choices made by Congress. These have sometimes been part of broader reform efforts. In other instances, they were made in the context of more routine legislative efforts, including the appropriations process. Each of these decisions, however, was shaped by the particular political circumstances in which they were made. Sometimes the relevant political context has been partisan. After Republicans assumed majorities in both chambers for the first time in 40 years in 1995, they advanced significant cuts to the legislative branch budget, including committee budgets and staff. A promise to eliminate one-third of committee staff had been part of the Contract for America platform, on which Republicans had contested the 1994 elections. House committee staffs have periodically grown since the large reductions in the mid-1990s, but they remain lower than their pre-1995 levels. Recent changes in the size of the members' representational allowance, which declined in nominal terms by roughly 13% between 2010 and 2019, have similarly been side effects of broader partisan conflict around the size of the discretionary federal budget. Separation of powers conflicts have also shaped staffing reforms. The creation of the Congressional Budget Office to provide Congress with its own internal capacity to produce budgetary information came as part of the 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. As you begin the important work of the Select Committee, you will face many of these same challenges, but I encourage you to draw useful lessons from these and other historical episodes of reform.
Thanks very much. Next up, Mr. Strand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for inviting me to testify today. This committee, I think, is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to strengthen the People's House. Major congressional reforms tend to be needed every 20 to 30 years. As congressional processes break down, they are often fixed through a reform committee like this one. To help you work, I want to share some of the achievements from the past, reform efforts, and some of the lessons learned from them. We've written 2 papers at the Congressional Institute, one on a general history of reform and the other on lessons learned from the 1993 reform process, which I hope you'll have an opportunity to consider. The three joint committees on the Organization of Congress in the 20th century thought big. They looked at the entirety of Congress, and they thoughtfully approached internal functions and operations to see how the House and Senate could be made more effective. The first joint committee from 1945 to 46, in response to the massive expansion of the executive branch during the New Deal and World War II, it led to the Reorganization Act of 1946 that reduced the number of standing committees in the House from 48 to 19, and the Senate from 33 to 15. It provided increased staff and money for members to run their offices. It required lobbyists to register, and it increased member salaries and provided for a civil service pension. The next joint committee met from 1965 to 66, and although it took a while for the reforms to be adopted in the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970, they were able to require all committee roll call votes and votes in the House Committee of the Whole to be made public. Before that, they were only reported in the aggregate. It implemented electronic voting in the House. It permitted television and radio coverage of committee hearings in the House, and established the House Legislative Counsel Office. The third joint committee in the Organization of Congress met in 92 and 93. It developed many reform ideas that, though not adopted at the time, were later adopted after Republicans took control of the House the following year. Some of the reforms were imposing term limits for committees and subcommittee chairs, clarifying jurisdictional lines among committees, banning proxy voting in committee, again, requiring records of open votes in committee. That was the second time they did that too. And they adopted the Congressional Accountability Act. Each of these joint committees streamlined operations and increased transparency. There are other vehicles for reform that I discuss in my written testimony. For instance, each party has internal rules that affect the operations of the House, such as the makeup of the Rules Committee, the selection of committee chairs, and the filling of committee vacancies. I would note that restrictions on earmarks, clearly a reform topic worth examining, are actually restrictions imposed by party caucuses, not the rules of the House. The rules of the House are actually very robust and transparent when it comes to earmarks. Today, Congress finds itself ready for another round of reforms, and so I'd like to share with you some of the lessons we've learned from these previous committees. First, the deadlines you have are important, but they should not be seen as the end date for your work, nor the expiration date for your ideas. Developing ideas creates an inventory of reforms that Congress can implement in response to a crisis or is there a sudden critical need. A few years from now, a new select or joint committee could say the 2019 Kilmer-Graves Committee had this great idea, let's adopt it. Aim big and understand that your work will be part of the history of the Congress and not just a short-term solution to some temporary problems. Second, I would urge you that reforms provide value to the lives of your constituents on issues such as the budget and authorization reform and opening up the floor to new ideas. While Congress could use more resources, it's not likely to be approved by your constituents without something they value, such as fixing the broken budget process. Third, get as much buy-in as possible from your colleagues. Take special care to win over the chairs, the ranking members, and the leadership. Lee Hamilton, the House chairman of the 1993 Joint Committee, warned us that leadership and committee chairmen become wary if reform means their own power base will be disrupted. To get committee chairs excited about reform, look at reforming the authorization process. A committee that cannot pass an authorization bill forfeits its ability to hold the executive branch accountable. The Member Day hearing earlier this month was a great start. Leadership from both parties testified, and that tells us they are willing to be invested in your work. And finally, try as much as possible to create a bipartisan consensus. Over the last decade, the House has switched back and forth between the two parties. Whatever reforms are proposed, members may have to deal with as part of the majority or part of the minority during their careers. So being bipartisan is in everyone's interest. Not long ago, after the 2016 elections, the Congressional Institute commissioned a study of American attitude towards government, especially the question whether they think office holders hear them. One of the most important findings was that 43% of the American public thought the members of Congress were most responsible for ensuring that people are heard in the public debate. Americans expect leadership from the branch of government they feel closest to. I don't think it's clear that Congress can lead, though, without some reforms. In all democracy, legislatures always suffer the loss of power at the expense of the executive branch over time. Without proactive action, Congress risks diminishing its constitutional role as an equal branch of government. So what you're embarking on is really very important to our democracy. So I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. Mr. Wolfensberger.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, members of the Select Committee. I want to congratulate you all on being appointed to this very important Select Committee and commend you actually on being willing to accept a very big challenge, which is how to fix the institution. Let me say at the outset, the views I express are solely my own and not to be attributed to either of the two organizations with which I'm affiliated. What I have done in my written testimony is drawing directly on a report I prepared back in 2013 for the Bipartisan Policy Center's Commission on Political Reform that was headed up by Tom Daschle, Trent Lott, the former senators, Dan Glickman, Olympia Snowe, and Dirk Kempthorne. It was entitled Brief History of Congressional Reform Efforts, and I would commend that to your nighttime reading. The 6 major reforms that I allude to in my testimony go back to way back to 1945, has been mentioned here before. 4 of them I have found were successful, at least at the time. 2 of them were ffailures. The 4 successful ones that I designate are the 46 Reorganization Act, the 1960 or 70 Reorganization Act, the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, which has been found wanting lately, but I'm not sure that's a process problem, but we can talk about that further. And then the 4th successful one was the Ethics in Government Act of 1989. The 2 failures were ones that Walter Olezek glommed onto to write his well-known books on. One was the 1974 Committee Reform Amendments, which turned out to be a big turf battle. Tom Foley said that there's still blood on the Democratic caucus floor from that one. And the other one was the 93-94 legislative reorganization effort by the Joint Committee that was mentioned here, but a lot of those reforms were picked up the following year by the Republicans when they took over the House. What has prompted these various reform efforts? I look at that and concluded that you've had major crises that really spur Congress on to act, to improve things. One I refer to as constitutional crises, clashes between the branches, whether it's on budgeting, war powers, intelligence operation, maladministration, or whatever, but Congress has tried to remedy some of the problems that evolved from those clashes between the branches. The others are internal crises that have caused Congress to look at itself and determine how it can better things around here. And the major ones really were resulting from ethics scandals. So Congress would, time after time, come up with new ethics rules and procedures and organizations even, and decide that something had to be done there. I suspect that while my observation is that things have improved over the last 40 years or so, that a lot of that has to do with leadership stepping in more quickly now to remedy scandals that arise rather than wait for the prolonged ethics process to work itself through. The things that I came away with in terms of lessons that you might find useful from those successful efforts are the following 6. The perceived need for reform is very important. Does Congress really think there is a need, both that will improve the institution as well as help the congressional experience of individual members? Secondly, commit to checking partisan guns at the door. I think that's very important. Number 3, private informal meetings and briefings are important to help build trust, get members to know each other out of the public eye, and I think that's key to a committee holding together and doing something in a bipartisan way. Next, soliciting views of other members as to what they think the problems are, what they think the solutions might be, and that will give more buy-in when the time comes to start voting on some of these things. Number 5, full bipartisan leadership support is needed throughout from takeoff to landing, and that's where, if you read the inverse of some of these things, you'll figure out how some of the reforms failed. And finally, flexibility on the part of the reform panels to be willing to compromise even after you make recommendations if you run into unanticipated obstacles. So I've suggested at the conclusion of my testimony that you might consider confining your major efforts and focus to 3 or 4 areas which you think are the biggest failings of Congress and how they might be addressed. These are budgeting timetables, improved oversight, and that will be a prerequisite to restoring the authorization process, which I think is essential. Number 3, encouraging greater members' initiatives and participation in the process as an offset to the over-centralized leadership control of things today. And finally, improving staff resources and capacity, I think, is important as well. But we can discuss any of these further. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Super. I'd like to thank all five of you for your terrific testimony and for the written testimony you provided. I'm going to make sure that we give everybody a chance to answer questions or ask their questions. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. And I want to start with Dr. Lawrence and Mr. Wolfensberger. So as I read through some of the history of some of the past reform efforts, it seems like there's been this swing back and forth between empowering committees and centralizing power. And since I got here more than a little over 6 years ago, there's been this notion of returning to regular order and re-empowering the committees. I'm curious what you see as what the structural issues are that stand in the way of that actually happening. Dr. Lawrence, you, in your written testimony, highlighted the fact that floor time often overlaps with committee time. And I'm literally right now in 3 subcommittees at the same time. But, and Ms. Reynolds spoke to staffing issues, but I'd like to get your sense of what's contributing to this challenge of actually re-empowering committees getting at regular order.
Well, I actually think that some of that goes beyond the organizational questions. I think it's linked to what I mentioned in my testimony, the growth of parity between the parties in the competition, and the narrow margins means it's harder to put together votes. It's harder to find bipartisan votes because you don't have as many people in the middle, and people who vote in the middle tend to become victims and targets rather than heroes. And so I think more and more it has fallen to leadership on both sides to exercise discipline over the design of legislation and the management of legislation that comes before the House, because your chances of passing it are much different than for much of my career, where we had a great degree of ideological disparity within the caucuses, and you built bipartisan coalitions to pass legislation. On your point about the committees, however, I think getting members invested in the legislation is critically important, and that's difficult to do when, for whatever reason, however justified it is, that they feel that legislation is being usurped from the committee and the subcommittee process. Members come here, and I think freshmen much more so than when I first arrived in the mid-1970s, with an expectation of full participation. And when they become disenchanted and they find that they don't have the prerogatives with respect to offering amendments or full participation, I think they disinvest in the process. So I think it's really critical, as inconvenient and as time-consuming and frustrating as it is for the leadership. I just don't see an alternative if you want the leadership, the general membership, to be invested in the process and invested in the outcome. They have to have a more participatory and constructive role in the development of the legislation. That's the regular order.
Mr. Wolfensberger, you want to take a crack at it too?
I agree with what John said. My most recent book, published last November, is called Changing Cultures in Congress, From Fair Play to Power Plays. And in that I show that starting in the 70s and 80s, when we were more focused on doing real legislating, Congress had this regular order of committees reporting bills and so on. As a result of the change in, actually since the class of 74, I think, they decided that committee chairmen were often obstructing legislation that they wanted to see done. And so things shifted, first of all, to the subcommittee level, and then when that became chaotic, it went to the leadership. And the leadership is there to help with the culture of campaigning as opposed to culture of legislating. And I think that is a big swing in what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years. And how you get back, I think it's got to be step by step, but the leadership has to be willing to back off a little bit and give committees more leeway to do their thing. And the biggest complaint I've heard from members is they don't feel like they are really participating in the legislative process nowadays. They're just brought back here to vote on things that have already been decided by the leaders. What are the party positions? We've had 11 closed amendment rules in this session alone, beginning in late January. And all of those are on bills that were unreported. Why weren't they reported? Well, they're messaging bills. They're bills that the leadership puts out there, and they don't want anybody to mess around with amendments to interfere with that partisan message that they're trying to get across.
With the brief time I have left, Mr. Strand, I think you raise a good point about the number of programs that are unauthorized, and that gets at some of the issues around the committees, the breakdown of the committee process. I'm trying to figure out what the root problem is, though. right? Is it the breakdown of the committee process? Is it something else? When the last select committee on budget and appropriations process reform looked at this issue, and there was even some discussion about only appropriating to programs that had been authorized, but that seems like a recipe for disaster when there's so many programs that haven't actually been authorized. So give me a little direction here. Is there a thread we can pull on here that, and if you can make it brief, since I want to respect others on the.
No, a lot of it has to do directly with the breakdown of the budget process. Since everything gets tied up in this one big, massive omnibus appropriation bill at the end of the year, there's a rush to get through everything. It's actually against the rules of the House, as they exist, to appropriate unauthorized programs. Yet 2/3 of the non-defense discretionary budget is unauthorized. The authorization process is necessary to actually exert oversight over the executive branch, because that's how you regulate, was this a good program, was this a bad program, do we need more staff, do we want less staff, what do we cut? If you don't have an authorization bill, why should the administration care what you think? Because you're not holding them accountable, and they just go to the appropriators. And then the appropriators aren't really held accountable because everything's one big, massive bill. So I think you need to go to biannual budgeting. You need more time in the budget process. You need to have penalties. And right now, the incentive is to waive the point of order against the authorization bill. You need incentives to authorize again, which means maybe you can't appropriate the full amount of money on an unauthorized program.
Thank you. With that, the chair recognizes the distinguished vice chair for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of you. Your testimonies are fantastic. The written testimony is great. It's really great history for us to see and to read and to learn. I'm not sure if it's optimistic, but it's fair to say that this is a challenge. It would help me just from the onset if maybe you could tell the committee what it is you see the problem is we're trying to fix. Because we've heard from a lot of folks. We had a great member testimony day, but overall, if we're to measure success at the end of the day, what is it we're really trying to fix? Because of the previous reform efforts, as was described earlier, have come from a crisis or a scandal of some sort. Maybe help set us up for what it is we're trying to measure success, and I know each of you come from different perspectives, so maybe Mr. Lawrence and Wolfensberger and Ms. Reynolds could just, in your mind, your hopes for this committee and what we're trying to fix.
So it's a great question, and I think the fact that you got so many different answers to it when you spoke to members means that there are any number of problems and challenges that you could tackle. I think from at least the perspective that I focused on today about staffing, I think a real question is, does Congress have the capacity internally to get the information and expertise it needs to make good public policy decisions? We can talk at length about what the best way to structure that is, but I think at the end of the day, for me, again, reflecting on what I'm speaking about today, it really is what are the things that you can do to improve the quality of information that you have available to you in a timely manner to help you make better choices.
Thank you. Dr. Lawrence, any thoughts?
Thank you. Well, I think, as I said in my testimony, I think identifying, what this goal is really important so that you're not taking a scattershot approach. I mean, I'm a little skeptical about the capacity of the Congress itself to reducing the partisan nature of American politics because it's endemic in the society. It's reflected in Congress, but it's not because of Congress. And yet, I think that if you don't find a way of allowing the institution to take place in good faith consideration of policy, much of which doesn't necessarily descend into this bitter partisanship, it's very difficult to proceed. I mean, Congress will be successful when Congress learns how to be successful, and that is a possibility to do. But again, in my testimony, I say, if the floor is just basically used for weaponized purposes, and you only allow those amendments which the majority is going to allow to be considered, or the motion to recommit is simply a gotcha amendment, or 1 minutes and special orders are just opportunities for zinging the opponent and playing to the audience, well, then you're allowing the system itself to be contaminated for partisan purposes. So some of that you can really address. And a point that I didn't make I made in my written testimony, but not in the oral presentation, is a lot of people, both here, I think, and certainly outside the Congress, say, that can't happen. We've moved beyond that. And the only point I make is look back 10 years where in the worst possible circumstances, 6 weeks from an election with a divided government between a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, the Congress was able to come together in less than 2 weeks to pass massive emergency legislation to help the most unpopular human beings on the planet because it was necessary, because it was a crisis. I would hope that you can find a way to replicate that kind of collaboration absent the presence of a crisis. But I think there's got to be a determined effort here to look at where this partisanship is able to fester and thrive, and notwithstanding its existence in a broader area of the community, find a way at least to find ways to avoid it in the deliberations of the Congress.
Thank you. And Mr.
Yeah, I want to second what John said, but one of the things that I warn about in my testimony is don't expect any reforms that you might adopt to win over public approval of Congress. They don't pay attention to most of the procedural things. They know that members are fighting and so on, but what they're looking for is performance, better performance out of Congress. And how do you get that? You've got to involve members more in drafting, developing legislative policy, and I think that is pretty essential. You've got to please your own members first, and then eventually the public will be pleased if they see them acting better and getting things done.
Well, thank you for those, because I think it's important to this committee. I mean, the purpose, what is our purpose, and then how do we measure that success in the future? Is because one day there's going to be another reform committee, Mr. Chairman, and you and I or some of these gentlemen or lady might be sitting before that committee reporting on the results of this committee, and we get to write that history. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Lofgren.
Thanks very much. It's good to hear from all of you. There's so many things that could draw our attention, so I'll go to a little one and then maybe an extravagant one. First, the congressional staff salaries are limited because of our own salaries, and we have not given or allowed our own salaries to be increased, even cost of living, for more than 10 years, and I honestly don't foresee that changing anytime in the near future. That has made it possible to lose staff who want to stay here, but they have college tuition to pay. I mean, they can't afford to stay. So I'm wondering if you don't have to tell me now, but if there are other metrics that we could tie the staff salary to so that we could stem the tide of the loss of talented people at a staff level. That's question number one. How we might change the partisanship here is a very difficult question, because although sometimes we think we are doing it, I think in many ways we're reflecting the partisanship of the country, not creating the partisanship. And so the question is, can we be part of the remedy for the partisanship? And what reforms might lead in that direction? I think one of the issues is that we very rarely talk to each other. I was actually on the staff here before there was TV. And if you wanted to go and listen to a debate, you had to go to the floor and listen to the debate. And members were on the floor listening to each other. As soon as TV came on the scene, no one came to the floor. And understand we have a lot of other things to do. That we will never take TV away from the floor. I don't mean to say that, but it was a consequence that wasn't planned for. And it had consequences that were, I think, in some ways dire, because people no longer had to deal with each other in the way that had existed before that. So, and here's the extravagant question. The population of the United States has tripled, more than tripled, in the last 100 years. But the representation in the House of Representatives has stayed the same. Is part of our dysfunction the fact that we've frozen ourselves at the current number, and we have ever-increasing size districts, so we can't actually communicate with our constituents, that we are in 3 subcommittees because, the population's grown 3 times, but we stayed the same in 100 years? Should we even look at that? I'm interested in your thoughts. You want to start, John?
I don't think that, well, let me take your second point first. I don't think that expanding the size of the House is really the issue here. I think that raises a whole host of other questions, including equity questions when you get into some of the very small states as to how you would allocate seats if, for example, you went to 1 million or 1.5 million. So I'm not convinced that that is either feasible or even really would resolve the underlying problem. I think there are certainly issues that can be dealt with in terms of how districts are drawn, and I think we're all familiar with the issues that are raised by gerrymandering and by more independent designation of district lines, and I think that's probably a better way to think in terms of getting districts that are not driven by a partisan and electoral motivation and therefore necessarily produce people that ilk. On the money question, I thought there were some important reforms that were done while I was still here to help particularly the more middle and lower level staff people, in terms of affordability of childcare or paying for educational expenses. I stayed around for 38 years and obviously, I guess maybe I could have made money somewhere else so that there weren't a lot of offers out there. But I'm not sure it's at the upper end that it's the biggest problem, because I do think
It's at all levels.
I think the people who are staff directors and chiefs of staff and committee, they're getting other things in terms of the role they play. But I do think it's really tough on people who are in that middle level, and there you don't run into the same problem with the member salary, surpassing the member salary. So a combination of bumping up middle-level staff and maybe finding other ways to non-monetarily, in terms of salary, supplement the benefits that middle-level staff get, I think would be
Well, I see my time has expired, so if you have thoughts on that, I would welcome them later. I don't want to dominate it, but I'll just say in terms of computer experts, we're looking at that, and the most we can offer is what an entry-level programmer gets in my district. I mean, you can't compete.
Thanks, Mr. Whittle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first reform would be I need about 20 minutes to inquire amongst these witnesses, and I'll leave that to your discretion as that goes on. Talking about what the goal is, and I think Mr. Strand said it best, it's to strengthen the people's house. There's no future of America that I believe is disadvantaged by the people who are closest to the American citizen being stronger in their ability to represent that. And I think that is our goal, and I'll support any proposal that moves us in that direction. With that as a backdrop, the incentive today, because I do have a large constituency, as the chairwoman suggested, I need to be on lots of committees and lots of subcommittees, and so I can't be anywhere. And that also has the impact of I need to be on those subcommittees because the floor today doesn't accept amendments as it once did. Those things fall out in conference in a very strange way of having that happen in ways they might not have. Tell me about the historical context of work being done in committee and the floor, as opposed to today where work is done in the committee instead of on the floor. Walter, can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, sure. A little bit. Certainly you go back to the, well, I don't know when exactly, pre-'80s, but certainly, the time I've been here when I started in the late 60s, that, there was a lot of work done in committee, obviously, and a lot of work done on the floor. A good example would be the National Defense Authorization Act. Back then, the Defense Authorization Bill was probably on the floor a week or so, if not less, but certainly 6 or 7 days. Lots of strategies involved in terms of the floor amendment process, lots of debate and dialogue that went on between the two sides, and a lot of members. And on the authorization question, as an aside, I mean, that's got the imprimatur of a must-pass bill. How do you get other authorization bills to also have that must-pass instead of being postponed? So you compare that to back then to where we are today, and of course the dramatic difference is in a lot of respects, even on committees, in terms of how they've changed, but also, of course, in the rise of, we'll call them structured, restrictive, closed rules, if you will, that the decision is almost pre-decided in terms of what's going to take place in debate. And this really goes to the message agenda, I think, of the two parties. Maybe we need to spend more time trying to craft policies, and the only way you can craft effective policies, I think, is going to what others have said about strengthening the committees.
Well, I thought that was interesting in Mr. Wolfensberger's testimony. He said he's got 6 things that make these reform efforts successful. By my count, 4 of the 6 things were things that that transparency, too much transparency, might threaten. Private informal meetings are necessary. Check your partisan guns at the door, he said. Soliciting views from other members who are not on the panel, and flexibility and the ability to compromise. At some point, you know, the reason I can't take pictures on the second floor of the Capitol is you never know who I might be talking to, and I want the freedom to be able to talk to who I want to talk to. We don't have that dynamic. Zoe said we're not going to roll back cameras on the floor. I'm sure that's true. It might have been, I'm not sure who mentioned transparency. It was you, Mr. Strand. Are we at a point where we have so many other ways to communicate, to get the word out, that it would be okay to dial back on some degrees of transparency because we're highlighting that transparency elsewhere?
You know, transparency is always an issue depending on the public interest. You ever notice the less interest the public is in an issue, the more bipartisan you are? Right? I mean, this is the reality, is that this is why the committee process is so effective, because it goes back to what the Chairman Lofgren said before, is that when you have common interests, you go past the partisanship. That's what gets you past that. When on the floor, when, you know, the Congress is kind of behaving like a parliament in some ways, without any of the efficiencies of a parliament, because everyone's voting by party. As a result, you know, the party, everyone has to get their votes within the same party, which is very difficult for a majority. It wasn't that long ago that it was very common to have a lot of mixed votes from both parties on both sides of both issues, because members would vote their interest. If they're only voting their party, it's much more difficult to then turn around and make bipartisan compromise. And the benefit of the committee system being strengthened is it tends to focus on members' interest and the interest of their districts. There are no Republican and Democrat cows, you know, so agriculture policy is pretty much the same in each district. And so I think we need to get back to that vigorous committee process where members can focus on common interests with each other.
Let me just briefly supplement that and go to put in a plug for John Lawrence's book on the class of '74. And one of the epigraphs to his introduction, he has a quote from his boss, George Miller, who said, "We were a conquering army. We stormed the Bastille. We destroyed the institution by turning on the lights." Now, there's a lot of truth to that. At the end of my prepared statement, I talk about transparency being a two-sided coin. Yes, sunlight is the best disinfectant, according to Brandeis, but also you can get skin cancer. So I think there have got to be ways that you can dial back without violating the overall idea of transparency, which goes to accountability. But what we've done in having things so transparent is to drive the real decision-making behind closed doors between the leaders and the committee chairman and shutting out most members.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lawrence, you had mentioned C-SPAN, and I don't think we can undo that. That's not, and I'm not even sure that we can do much to regulate it, because you know, I mean, we're supposed to be the national protectors of free speech, but make no mistake, a lot of the pain begins with words. I mean, I cannot overstate the power of words. But to my colleague, Ms. Loughran, a few minutes ago, you know, I'm not sure either that we're not simply reflections of a rush downhill by the American public. Give me an example. Two things. One, we have members who will go on the floor every week, and they have an audience, and we have people, and they're insults. I mean, you know, you just insult everybody. And then we had a member a few years ago to do something in a very public setting, and was reprimanded by both sides. But as a result of what that member did, between the Tuesday that he said it and the following Tuesday, he raised $4.7 million. I don't know how we can fix that unless we understand that all of us are contributing to this dysfunctionality. And one of the things that I don't think we can regulate the people who go on the floor every week. They're going to do it. I represent the largest city in the state of Missouri, but I also represent Oric, Excelsior Springs, Sweet Springs, Richmond, Odessa, Grandview, Marshall, Slater, Higginsville, Lexington. If everybody in here had my district, if everybody had 435 members with my district, it would clean itself up quickly. I not only have to know the price of pork bellies, I need to know, what the allocation of community development block grant is going to do. How many Section 8 certificates are we going to approve? So it boils down to something that I'm not sure we can do, but if we don't do redistricting in the most blatantly unpartisan way that it can be done, I think it is for naught. We're going to have heterogeneous districts, and the districts, will cheer people. If you don't cuss anybody out or don't say anything nasty, or they're not going to be happy with you. And so we have a district. We need. I think that's something. I don't even know why I brought it up. It's not going to happen, and so I hope we don't continue to go downhill. What I do think we can do is the yellow lighter zone, is to try to proactively eliminate problems. And that's where I think we need to have an ongoing body, Mr. Chairman, that would meet regularly, not every quarter of a century, every century. We need a body that is appointed by the Speaker and the Majority Leader in every Congress, sitting around a table like this, trying to be proactive in discontinuing things that happen. I mean, how can we just had some controversies. What's the best way to get that done, and done quickly, and in a bipartisan way? And we don't have that. I'll write this, but I really do think this committee ought to be the most permanent committee we have. If we can stop things from happening, if we can prevent things from happening, I don't know if anything could be better. I yield back.
Thanks, Mr. Cleaver. Does anyone want to take 30 seconds or so to respond to that, or?
I would just quickly reiterate something I said in my statement. I mean, I think that this committee has the ability to address, and the Rules Committee has the ability to address this issue of the tenor of remarks on the floor. There are certain parameters as to what is acceptable language and what is not, and I think that in the light of the fact that people have the ability now to go on Twitter and YouTube and fulminate all day long, they don't need to be taking up time on the floor doing that. When people out in the real world turn on the TV and they see members of Congress excoriating each other in the most hyper-partisan political way, they don't make the distinction between that and serious debate. And members know that, and I think we all have written those speeches and those gotcha amendments. That deteriorates from the public regard for the institution. And you have the ability to not to censor people, but to temper what the level of political rhetoric and acceptable rhetoric is on the floor. And as I suggested, you may want to take a hard look at 1 minutes and special orders and how integral they really are to the business of the legislative responsibilities of the Congress, and get rid of at least that gratuitous partisanship that most Americans are horrified about, frankly, when they see it on the floor of the Congress.
Can I dissent? Having been in the minority more than the majority, I think that one of the few chances that the minority members have to talk about issues they want to talk about is during special orders. I don't care that much about 1 minute where you're congratulating the local team for winning the state championship. You can do away with those if you want, but I think the special orders can be an important policy discussion forum. But Mark just reminded me of something else. In 1965, the Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress recommended that there be a permanent Joint Committee on Congressional Operations, and that was adopted in 1970 as part of the Legislative Reorganization Act. And that lasted for a few years, and then the Senate got rid of most joint committees, so we had a select committee for a while. But the whole idea was to have an ongoing look beyond what the Rules Committee could do or House Administration could do as to how Congress is operating, what it can do to improve itself. The one big thing that came out of that joint committee operation, the permanent joint committee operation, was that they put pressure on to have televised proceedings in the House to counter the president, who was able to commandeer the airwaves at a whim and talk about the Vietnam War, and Congress had no way to respond directly. So the whole idea was that Congress should have more exposure to the American people to discuss some of these issues.
Thank you. Let me yield 5 minutes to Ms. Brooks.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for being here. In building on that a little bit, as a former ethics chair, and actually, and I'm sorry that Ms. Lofgren is gone, because obviously as chair of House Admin and ranking of House Admin, those are committees that maybe if we were to either change some of our rules or require them to address some of these things. House Admin, that's what I just asked Rodney, isn't that what you guys are supposed to do? And same thing with ethics, relative to the behavior and speech on the House. And I think maybe we as a committee could be looking at reforming some of those rules or adding some tasks to committees that already exist. I'd like to ask a question building a little bit on transparency. What are your thoughts about how Congress can be more responsive to the public? Not just about, obviously, they have a view through C-SPAN, which celebrated its 40th anniversary yesterday, and is not going away, and we all receive just sometimes the most unkind comments on social media that people don't typically say to our face, although they do more now than they did even 7, 8 years ago. But how can we as a body be viewed as being more responsive to the public? That's my first question. And second question, you can all take a little bit of each of it, because past committees, leadership and or committee chairs maybe shelved recommendations. How do we make sure that doesn't happen this time? Because we all want to produce a body of work and come up with recommendations. It has to be bipartisan. How can we encourage our leadership and our committee chairs to listen to what we come up with? They appointed us, and I'd like to know that we're not wasting our time. Dr. Lawrence, and maybe if anyone wants to just go down the dais and help us with the leadership and or responsiveness.
Well, I would just echo what I'm sorry, I forget who said it, but I think ultimately the public's reaction is going to result from what the productivity of the Congress is, and I think it's very wise that Congress has invested in more district-oriented staff to be able to be responsive. But if you're looking, again, if one of the objectives here is to elevate public regard for the institution, then as I said in my testimony, the public is, on the one hand, seeing a lot of time being consumed by what seems to be nothing more than partisan bickering. And on the other hand, they see legislation that has 70, 80% popularity and it can't get a hearing in a subcommittee. You've got to be willing to mess it up. You've got to be willing to have those debates on the floor. You've got to be willing to thrash out these issues. And if the current process doesn't work, then maybe you need to think in terms of some other process that moves legislation along so that people have confidence that when there's a broad consensus within the electorate, it at least has its day on the House floor in committee. Any recommendations on leadership? On how we get leadership to pay attention to what we might be recommending, since you work for
My
a leader?
experience was the leadership was always very responsive.
Mr. Strand, thank you. Good answer.
Yeah, I think there's a couple.
Wish it were true.
One of the biggest issues to fix the legislature is to do more legislating. I mean, like the authorization process being fixed is important because that's where you actually deal with local issues. If you deal with one big omnibus appropriation bill, it's all the issues. I mean, it's all your constituents. But you can focus on things when you do the regular authorization process. Member-directed projects would be a good way to go back to getting more representation. It's constitutional. I mean, you're the only people elected specifically to represent your district. And someone's going to make the decision on where money's being spent. Shouldn't it be the elected representatives as opposed to a bureaucrat downtown? Two, it makes the authorization more important because if you're authorizing member-directed projects, members have a stake in the game in almost every legislation. And so there's more interest in getting things done because your individual constituents are being represented better. I think if when things get too big, it's either everyone's being affected or nobody's being affected. But when you break down the process and you legislate in smaller bills, like authorization bills and other legislation and member-directed projects, you get people more directly involved in what their member of Congress is doing, and you can be held more accountable by your own voters because they can look at something you did in the district to see whether or not it was a benefit or not.
Thank you. Anyone on the
Yeah, I would
leadership?
like to just address that
Seriously, the
briefly.
leadership
Go
is
ahead,
a
Molly.
real
Sure.
concern
So
for me.
one thing
On both sides of the aisle, by the way.
One thing to add on this point that we know from history is that successful reform episodes have often involved engaging and getting buy-in from groups of members with lots of different interests. So thinking about things like junior members who feel like they may not have a lot of say in how the institution is operating, all the way up to committee chairs who, are very protective of their jurisdictions, but might have their own interests. And so the extent that you can get kind of interest and buy-in as broadly across the board from as many different kinds of interests within the institution makes it more difficult to sort of ignore whatever it is you've come up with.
Thank you.
And I just might add, as I mentioned in my testimony, leadership has to be fully committed to the reform effort from the takeoff to the landing. And the way to do that, I think, you started out well with Members' Day, where you had both Speaker Pelosi and McCarthy and Hoyer, I believe, all testifying. They indicated a willingness to let this committee do its thing, but keep them apprised as you go along. And I think you'll have better buy-in if you say, we're not out to strip you of power, we're out to have better power sharing so members can get back into the game.
Thank you. Yield back.
Super. Thank you. Ms. Delbene.
Thank you. Thank you for all being here. I really appreciate your feedback on these as we start to tackle these important issues, but also kind of based on Susan's comments too, some tough issues. I wanted to get at committee jurisdiction because the way the world work has changed greatly. We have new technologies, new issues that no one anticipated. And when we talk about every member having an equal voice and making sure that they're tackling issues that have equal weight, what do each of you think in terms of committee jurisdictions, how that's laid out, and the impact that has on the functioning of the overall body? Mr. Strand is smiling already, so.
I'm thinking that the guy whose textbook I assigned, Walter Olezek, should answer that question.
Well, anybody can answer.
Walter, tell them about the 12 jurisdictional changes that the Joint Committee proposed.
Right. Well, all I can say from experience is that anytime you take on the topic of jurisdictional realignment, I mean, it's really a tough one because jurisdiction equals power. And generally, members don't like to give up power. And this is bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans on a committee. So when you try to strip something away on the theory that you will consolidate and streamline and address issues that were never around then before, like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and all of that, I mean, they cut across a lot of committees today. And so in order to consolidate more, then you have to take something away and give it to somebody else. And my experience is this is the toughest nut to crack. Richard Bowling, we spent 2 years on this, and all we got was havoc. In terms of your question about, we went to the Democratic caucus and submitted the plan early, and that just blew it up because he probably had the most significant realignment of committees ever. And it also blew up in part the Joint Committee, as Don mentioned, because some of the members, David Dreyer, wanted to have jurisdictional realignment. And what broke it apart was at a Rules Committee session, when some Rules Committee members were sympathetic to it, a call came through and the hearing was recessed for a while, or the markup, and all of a sudden the chair comes back and recesses the hearing, never to reemerge ever again. The committee that collapsed. I mean, I am sympathetic with committee refiguring, no doubt about it. But it's tough. You've really got to do a lot of work, a lot of preparatory work, and it goes to the question about how you get something through. You start at the beginning in terms of your consultations with all kinds of members, groups in the House of Representatives. And then you get from them and however buy-in, survey the members, survey the staff, and you get some kind of buy-in. And then when you develop your product, after you sift through it, these are the things that we think are good, these are the things that are not so good and never going to make it through. And on the good, how can we package it so that it's going to pass enough members of the House to really be significant? But jurisdiction.
I think part of it is that we do have a changing world, and if Congress is going to be modern and kind of appropriately tackle those, and it also gets into staffing, which I was going to ask you, Ms. Reynolds, because, for example, many members brought up on Member Day the Office of Technology Assessment and how important that was. If we're going to make sure we have the skill set we need to help give people feedback on how to address these issues, one, we have to have the appropriate committee or area to tackle it, and two, we have to have the right people. And so it seems like, and tomorrow things could look even different. So the question is, how do we ever stay ahead on this? And maybe I'll turn to you, Ms. Reynolds, about the need for people in these areas and what you think of things like the Office of Technology Assessment. That's one example that came up, but there's probably others too.
Yeah, and I think the renewed interest in OTA from folks on this committee and more broadly reflects a real need for increased scientific and technological expertise within the institution. Whether the answer to that is bringing back OTA, whether there's been some effort at GAO to bolster its internal scientific and technological expertise. I think there are a lot of different specific options we could take, but I do sense that that's an area of interest, and it's incredibly important as we have an increasingly complex world.
And I think Ms. Lofgren's point on some folks with those skills are highly in demand in other areas and can make more in other areas makes it a challenge as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just piggybacking off of what my good friend Ms. Del Bene just said on technology, we have a tremendous problem with the House technology systems. I mean, our own constituent management software systems, I mean, we have allowed a duopoly to be created with two systems that we get to choose from, and they're the only ones that can utilize the system in place. Now, I would also say I agree that we are not up to date, not just with technology, but with personnel and our ability to hire personnel. But the sheer fact we do hire some of the technology folks from the private sector, we're hiring them on a contract. But our existing operations limit what they can do versus what they can do in the private sector. And that is something I hope this committee can address and get into the weeds to address the institutional backbone of the problems that wouldn't allow new personnel, no matter where they came from. Bill Gates could come here and he'd still be hamstrung by some of the limitations that we've put in place by our own actions, or better yet, our inactions. Mr. Chair, I'm glad that you brought up your playlist. A little disappointed. Yeah, I am, Mr. Pocan and I share a unique playlist together, but the song that you should have brought up, and I agree, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us, and we ought to succeed, but the Talking Heads song that keeps coming to my mind is "It's the Same as It Ever Was," and that's the institution. Look, I spent 16 years as a district staffer. I spoke to the district directors for our side of the aisle that are out here today, and many of the same issues they faced were the same issues I faced before I got elected here 6.5 years ago. So we're dealing with institutional problems that we have to face. Now, thank you all very much for being here. It really helps us, and I think your testimony will allow us to move forward. Ms. Reynolds, you mentioned maybe bring back the OTA, GAO. I'm of the impression, as a former staffer and now a member, and I really love this House Administration Committee and this Select Committee, I think we do a lot of studying. We don't do a lot of implementing the solutions. And that's what I think we as members need to focus on too. Mr. Wolfensberger, the 4 areas you identified as needing the most work on here were budgeting timetables, lack of adequate oversight and authorizing activities, centralized leadership. Ms. Brooks adequately addressed that, and obviously we need to move forward there. And the inadequate staff resources and expertise. All 4 worthy of a discussion, but I would like to specifically ask you, what type of solutions do you think could address the lack of adequate oversight in authorizing activities within this institution?
You know, the 2 mistakes that were made by my party when they took over in '95 in the Contract with America procedural reforms was, 1, they cut back committee staff by 1/3, and that just knocked the legs out of any oversight capacity. The second was putting term limits on committee and subcommittee chairmen, three-term limits on them.
You think that's bad?
I think it is bad.
How do you think I'm the ranking member here?
Well, if you're a junior member moving up, well, then you like the idea of term limits on the existing committee and subcommittee chairs. But I think that just when members in chairs of committees or subcommittees are coming up to speed, they're asked to step down. And I think you've got to develop that expertise as well as having better expertise at the committee staff level. I know a lot of members bring staffers from their congressional staff on a committee staff, and I think that's good. There's got to be, I think, better orientation for them when they do come on, and CRS, I think, does a pretty good job. But there's just got to be a better way of training staff. Back in '70, they created 2 types of staff for committees, professional and clerical. Eventually, they got rid of that terminology because professional had sort of a nonpartisan air to it, but that was intended. They wanted to have some real experts running the staffs of committees. But
well, I appreciate your comments. I may not agree with all of them being the problem we have here within the House, but Dr. Lawrence, I know I don't have a lot of time left. The yellow light popped on, and Mr. Kilmer, because I made fun of his playlist, is not going to give me any extra time. It's interesting, you worked for leadership. And I enjoyed the comments, too, about the Rules Committee and the never-ending recess for some of the committee changes. Look, we know both sides, when they get into leadership, are going to push us, no matter how many good ideas we have, no matter how much it's bipartisan, no matter how much of a cross-section of our own conference can offer solutions to move good policies forward. Leadership's always going to be there. So how do we fix that? I mean, we're not going to change leadership. How do we succeed in the midst of the circumstances we've been given?
Well, I would just reiterate, I think you have to empower the membership through going, the membership, all of the members, other than leadership, there aren't that many of the members of the leadership, are
They obviously hold a lot of sway.
Pardon?
They obviously hold a lot of sway.
They do, but of course, they're responsive to the people who elect them. And those members have the ability, I think, to impress on the leadership on both sides the need for empowering members at the subcommittee and the full committee level. So
I am out of time, but you and I can have a discussion about the time 3 of us from a good cross-section of our conference offered some solutions, and I'll let you know how that went. All right?
I can guess.
John probably teaches Barbara Sinclair's book where she talks about principals and agents in Congress, and the principals are the members of the caucuses, and the agents are the leaders. In other words, the leaders better be responsive to the members, and I think John's former boss found it was a little more difficult to become Speaker this time around, and a lot of talking had to go on between her and her caucus in order to get sufficient votes on the floor to be elected Speaker. So to me, that was a sign of responsiveness.
I recognize Mr. Pocan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And thanks for being here. Appreciate that as well. Let me take a slightly different tact. So I feel like I've only been here, I got here in 2012, I've only been here in dysfunction. So I came from the Wisconsin legislature 14 years. That's how Derek and I have talked, coming from a body that I thought worked better. We had a nonpartisan reference bureau, nonpartisan fiscal bureau, nonpartisan audit bureau. We had a lot of national examples of how things went well. One of my very best friends is the current Republican Speaker, and yet I'm one of the most progressive members around here. What we have in common far exceeds what we don't have in common. We have these crazy 12 and 14-hour days, the travel schedules, the stalkers or trackers that follow campaigns, right? And you look at all of that, and yet we treat ourselves so poorly here that it affects the institution. So whether it be we can't ever talk about a pay increase or housing allowance. I mean, we have maybe, I think last session they said it could have been 80 members sleeping in their offices. Does not add to how this body functions. Flying back and forth, when you have to go through a small, I live in outside of Madison, a half hour west of Madison. It took me twice 14 hours to get here last July. I could have drove in 12 flying. 9 of my last 15 flights were seriously delayed or canceled. So when you take a 4-day week and you've got that coming in and that leaving, we have a 2-day work week. And I remember when I first got elected, one of our freshman peers got a really nice apartment because he thought we would get together and have dinner and talk about issues of the day. The next session, he got the crappiest efficiency he could get to save on money because he realized that's not what happened. So my question really is more around that. It also affects, if we don't do things, our staffing. We had a 1% MRA. I'm not happy with my leadership for that this session because I think that's not respectful of the institution. What do we do about that side of it? Because to me, it's the schedule, it's the, we got rid of earmarks even though we know our districts best. My job is to go back to my district and explain Washington and take their values here, and yet I am hamstrung in every way. Can you just address that aspect of what I'm trying to bring up? Because I do think that's something that I see as seriously dysfunctional.
I would say there are a couple of things. There are some things you should address. I mean, I think you may be the only legislative body in the entire world that doesn't have a housing allowance. I think one of the things you could do for staff is tuition reimbursement, because I think you're the only branch of the federal government that doesn't have tuition reimbursement for its employees. You could be holding bipartisan retreats. If you talk about doing it when you're in private, it could be a larger retreat, it could be smaller retreats, but I don't think we've done a genuine bipartisan retreat since about 2004, when we had about 70-some-odd members participate. But getting to know each other, as you said, is one of the keys to actually becoming good legislators, because you tend to talk to your friends better than you talk to people who you don't know. So I think there are a lot of things you can do. My one thing I would urge, though, is that I think you can do all these things in the context of the broader reform. So if you come up with a budget process, and I don't think you have to do it within the time limit they've given you, if you generate enough enthusiasm amongst your members, there's no reason this committee can't be continued, it can't generate new offshoots in areas of the budget, authorization reform, other things. I think if you can come up with some substantial reforms and say to do that, we need to retain valuable employees. We need to actually get the members talking to each other. I think you can do those things in exchange for coming up with some significant reforms so the public says, well, yes, I get that. If you make this better, I'm willing to support making these other things better too.
So I'll just add on the issue of the calendar specifically. Some of Don's colleagues at the Bipartisan Policy Center have an idea that Don can correct me if I'm wrong, but 3 weeks on, 1 week off, and 5-day work weeks in that context. And one thing that I think is really important about some sort of calendar reform along those lines is that it also gives you predictability. And I think that's a thing that we've heard a lot from, increasingly from junior members who are more likely to perhaps have young children back in their districts, is that that's as important as anything else, sort of knowing when I'm definitely going to have to be in Washington versus when I'm definitely going to be able to be home. And sort of tackling that question, again, I think will increase the efficacy that people feel about being in the body.
Things have changed quite a bit. Back in the 60s, most members had their families here in Washington when Congress was in session, and so they would then drive back during recesses back to their districts. But all that changed, I think, as things got more competitive, and it's more difficult to hold members here. Even back, though, in the 70s, when they're talking about the 70 Reorganization Act, members who did have their families here and wanted to work 5 days a week couldn't, because the East Coast folks would go back each weekend. It was just easy to get back by train or whatever to the districts, and so you deprive the House of a quorum, and so they're left here spinning their wheels, even though they're living right here in Washington.
The only thing I want to say, that's been a perennial topic since I've been here. And one of the things that Newt Gingrich tried to do, and he even created a committee, or at least one-person committee, to try to handle it, to come up with family-friendly scheduling. And I'm not sure that lasted very long. The dilemma in part is that this has become, for a long period of time now, sort of a commuter college, commuter Congress. It's very difficult to keep members here when the re-election incentives and the demands back home are so high. and you also want to go back and visit your families and kids if you have them. And so it's really hard to, these 3-to-1, 2-to-2, 1. I mean, they've been around. They tried it in the Senate, 3-to-1. George Mitchell, when he was around as majority leader, tried it. And what happened? Maybe it lasted a couple of weeks or a month because members just personally adjourned and went home. And that might happen here.
Yeah, I would say, again, a lot of things have changed since the days when you had members staying here. Spouses have their own careers. They're not going to just come up and move here and go back and forth and interrupt them. So the notion that members are going to be away for weeks at a time is much more problematic. But this notion that there's this easy transportability just doesn't work as well. I mean, one thing that hasn't come up in terms of the internal order that I think is worth thinking about is just the scheduling of committee and floor activities for your own planning. I mean, I think that this notion of, I know we're not supposed to have committee meetings when the House is in session. We're not supposed to be voting when there are committee meetings. But in point of fact, rules are waived all the time. Committee meetings are fragmented. Votes are clustered at the end of the day. So members are running in with 5-minute votes, not knowing what they've voted on, which exacerbates the whole problem of not having been on the floor. So I think getting control over that period of time when you are here and perhaps setting aside days for committee meetings and days for floor activities so you have the ability to really work collaboratively and spend time with each other and chew through these as opposed to rushing around and, in for an hour and a half and then you're on the floor for 15 minutes. That just, I think, only exacerbates the sense of chaos and difficulty of planning. And I think that has an impact on the quality of life and the quality of the work.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I got to tell you, this has been a very productive conversation so far, and I appreciate you guys being here. And I think a lot of the things that we've been talking about, I think we're touching on what the problem is. I'm not sure if we found exactly the solutions, but building off some of the other questions, I, for one, have been saying for a while that we need to get rid of the TV cameras. I'm all for transparency, but it seems like since they've been put in, everybody's just playing to the cameras. But I'm starting to realize that maybe they're just the symptom. That's just a symptom. The real bigger problem is, like you guys have been talking about today, the real opportunity or ability for members to engage in policymaking because of the top-down approach that we both experience. We've been relegated to just, regurgitating the talking points from our side. And when was the last time we really had an honest, true debate in this institution? It's rare, unfortunately. It's rare. And so some of these things that we've been talking about to bring us back to allowing members to be engaged, to be part of the process, I think there would be a lot less of the feeling that you had to be partisan because you own or you have ownership in whether you win or lose, you have ownership in what's happening. And in that, if that's the case, then the TV cameras should be there. So I'm still trying to get my head around all of this and what the problem is and what the solutions should be. But I think you guys have helped shine a lot of light on where this discussion should go. So I appreciate that. Not every single one of the folks that came on Member Day to testify brought this up, but a lot did. And I think we're reluctant to touch the committee realignment issue, but it seems as though that is also something that we maybe should look stronger at. I know our chairman maybe don't want to, but it sounds like it's something that's a common thread. So anyway, I did have a couple of questions, but all this discussion fortunately is getting our minds going to a lot of different things that we should be talking about. But Mr. Strand, you talked a little bit about the budget process. And that whole process is not only frustrating for those of us here, it's frustrating for the people we represent as well. And you did talk about the efforts at reform in the 70s and also in the 90s. I heard you say biennial budgets. I think that's great, something we should be exploring. earmarks, so you didn't use that word, but member-directed appropriations, those kind of things. But could you maybe expound a little bit more on that budget process and how we could improve that?
No, I'm pleased to do that. And the Congress a little bit did take on last year, and the special committee on the reform of the appropriation and budget process did come to some conclusions, although they weren't able to finalize their project. But they did come up with biennial budgeting as something. We need 2 years process to budget.
Most states do.
Yeah. You need to restore the authorization process so that bills aren't appropriated without authorizations. And you can create incentives. Right now, the incentives are not to authorize. You have to reverse it to create incentives to make sure they actually do authorize. You should change the fiscal year to January 1st and just acknowledge reality. Because that's what it takes. I mean, it takes a full calendar year. We don't have enough time to finish it by October 1st because by the time you get to September, you're already so close into the election process, it's very hard to finalize a budget process. So change the fiscal year to match the calendar year. That would be a great way to do it. I think restoring earmarks gives everyone sort of skin in the game in the authorization and appropriation process. You start to build bipartisan majorities for legislation because, generally speaking, if you have something for your district in the bill, you're more likely to vote for it than you are to just sort of swallow the party line. So there are a number of reforms you should do. And I should point out, there was a select joint committee that created the 1974 Budget Act. It's 50 years old now, though. It's time to revisit it, and Congress should once again take that on, is coming up with a new budget process that can actually work. And why not? After 50 years, it probably should be addressed.
It's about time, yeah.
So one thing to add on budget process reform that touches on your point about committee jurisdictions is that the 1974 episode illustrates a really important dynamic about what happens when you simply layer new structures on top of existing power structures. So the 74 Act created the budget committees and just sort of put them on top of the existing structure of appropriations and authorizing committees. And so everyone still had power. And so one consequence of that is that when you created the budget committees and you gave them some power, the appropriators and the authorizers still had power, and so that created a sort of tension when you were trying to avoid taking power away from someone else. So that's a sort of a point that bridges those two observations.
The same thing happened when Congress created the Homeland Security Committee, or the House did. They forgot to realign the jurisdictions from other committees, and so now anything that affects Homeland Security goes to maybe 10 committees.
Exactly, yeah. So it's not very efficient at all.
On budget, Dave Obey, who was Chairman of Appropriations, famously said that Congress forgot to add 4 months to the calendar when they created the Budget Committee. And that's significant, I think, because what it does is it moves everything later in the year, as you were saying, and as a result, all the appropriations becomes compressed. You lose August, you lose much of September. By the time you're supposed to be deliberating, you're down to basically CRs and omnibuses. You don't have vigorous debate, and you don't have the ability to amend, and so everybody's stumbling towards September 30th and then a series of CRs. So I think really seriously looking at that and the alignment of the budget process and the appropriations process is a really significant thing for you to do.
Can I just add one thing, and that is on Homeland Security, when Don mentioned that, when it was created, there was a select committee established to figure out what to do with this Homeland Security issue. So they created a select committee, and we got the Homeland Security Committee in the House. And jurisdiction was divided deliberately. Why? Because, as Dreyer called it, we call that creative redundancy. That you needed to, in order to get it through, this idea of a Homeland Security Committee, you had to divide the pieces. And theoretically, what's there to help it out is the multiple referral process put in place in 1975. And also, they crafted a memorandum of understanding about how they would divide their various issues that go to other committees as well.
Well, we could learn an awful lot from you guys. I appreciate you being here. I did want to talk more about the staffing reductions and how we can beef that up. So, Ms. Reynolds, thank you for your testimony in the written form, too. But maybe we can invite these folks back, Mr. Chairman.
We got a few months. Ms. Scanlon. Yep, you're up.
I want to start by thanking Chairman Kilmer and Ranking Member Graves for putting this hearing together, and thank our witnesses for your very thoughtful testimony, written and oral. as a newbie here, trying to figure out how all this works. I've already had the opportunity to meet with Mr. Olezek, who was very helpful in indoctrinating me in the mysteries of the Rules Committee during orientation, so I appreciate that. Because I'm coming at this from the newbie's perspective, that one of the first things I've had to deal with is staffing. I come to this venture from being in a private law firm, which is not unlike being in Congress. Lots of chiefs, not too many Indians, and people really wanting to have their own individual fiefdoms. But as I've been in this process, it does seem as though a little more uniformity with respect to policies and setup of offices might be helpful. Can you speak to that, Ms. Reynolds? There was a little bit about that in your testimony.
Absolutely. So you're far from the first person to raise this as a challenge of setting up a new member office. And I think I would commend that as an area for this committee to explore, to figure out what are areas where you don't need 435 separate decision makers. How do you balance the tension of preserving the ability of members to run their offices as they see fit with supports that are in place to help them make good decisions when they're doing that? So I would really encourage you to consider that as one of the things this committee takes on.
Okay. Another piece that I saw in your testimony that was interesting to me was the compression of the numbers of staff that we have. And it looked to me, and I just wondered if you could tell me if I'm reading the charts correctly and whether you have further comments on this, as though over time the number of staff that members have to support them has shrunk, but then an increasing percentage has shifted towards district work as well.
Yes, that's correct. So we at Brookings track data on congressional staff. The Congressional Research Service also tracks data on congressional staff. And so we have seen both a decline in the number of staff and a shifting of the staff that in-house members' personal offices away from Washington.
So overall, we have less people focused on legislation and policy at this point?
Yes.
Okay. It's such a challenge to get up to speed on all the issues and try to, be on top of them. Has your group looked at all at staff diversity? Because that's been a concern. I was working on those issues in the law firm world and have been trying to work on it here. It's a little more challenging, particularly with private salaries being more than competitive.
Absolutely. It's not something we've looked at specifically, but there are other folks around town who have done work on the issue. And one thing that we were talking a little bit about staff pay before. And one thing, and John raised the point of sort of thinking about pay at the top versus in the middle and at the bottom. And I would say that if you are particularly interested in questions of staff diversity, I would encourage you to look at sort of the pay structure of lower level employees because of sort of pipeline concerns, that you're never going to get staff diversity at the top levels if you don't have staff diversity at the bottom. And so when you think about staff pay, the answers really depend on what you think the problem is. And so if you are worried about staff diversity, which I think is a real concern, and I would recommend that you all think about that as well, I think that's closely tied to these questions of what we pay folks.
Right. I think it's one piece of it, but the other thing we've been trying to do sort of intentionally is expanding the net of who we're talking to, so making sure that we're going and seeking out diverse candidates as well.
And I will say that the recent effort to provide offices with funds to pay interns is also a really important part of this overall puzzle.
Sure, ensuring that people can work here even if they can't afford to do so for free.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Strand, you touched a little bit on earmarks, which is a conversation that I've heard a little bit about since I got here. But my recollection from kind of the wider public discourse back when earmarks were abolished was, oh my God, earmarks are a pit of corruption and we have to get rid of them. So this seems like one of those touch points where public perception is going to be an issue. Can you just expound a little bit on whether there's value to earmarks? What are going to be the pitfalls?
Yes. I think part of the problem was when earmarks became add-ons, it became a bit of a problem because it distorted the budget process. And there were a few very high-profile cases that just made it an easy target. But the reality, the House set up a very transparent process that's still on the books, whereas members have to take credit, name the project, they have to give a description of the project, and it has to be put in the record so that all your constituents should see it. The key to, if you're not willing to do a press release on an earmark, you shouldn't be allowed to do it, because it should be as completely transparent as possible. And, and then your district can decide whether or not you pick the right priorities. But that's something for you to go back home and argue with your constituents. The key to earmarks being successful is transparency and staying within the budget limits. The money's going to be spent in your district. Who should decide where it's spent? The Constitution says you, as opposed to someone down the executive branch of the government.
Or someone in the lobbying world. That became a problem, too. We had one lobby shop that was dedicated to getting educational earmarks for various universities, and that became sort of a scandal in and of itself because they were really sort of superimposing their ideas on members of Congress when they had already talked to universities in their districts. So that became very distorted, and it just sent Robert Byrd up the wall because he just did not like that practice whatsoever.
Yeah, I would agree that transparency is the key. I know when we tried when I was Associate Chief of Staff to require greater disclosure, to put restrictions on earmarks for-profit organizations, for banning them in being dropped into conference committees. But again, I teach my classes this all the time. Somebody's going to make that decision about whether or not the dredging of your harbor or the freeway overhang is not, and it might as well be you if you're held accountable for it as to whether or not that was the right expenditure of money. Understanding that your state Department of Transportation may have come up with a different list, but they may not particularly care about your harbor or your overpass. But I think accountability is the key, and so is finding a new name for earmarks.
Okay, member-directed spending.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Timmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the distinguished panelists and taking the time to come up here and share your thoughts on this important issue. I got sworn in on January 3rd, and one of the first things that was given to me was this. It's a pager, and I literally thought somebody was playing a joke on me. And I've been thinking about how technology can make this job easier, more efficient, better. And, I often thought about the fact that Strom Thurmond, former senator from South Carolina, he was just notorious for the most incredible constituent services. And he did that decades ago without email, without even fax machines, pre the pager. So I guess my question, I have two questions. First question is, historically, what technology has really substantially altered the way that this body functions, modernized it in a sense, and where do you think technology has the potential going forward? Because while I think that this is ridiculous that I was given this, when it was given to the person in 1995, it was probably the best thing they've ever had. So just, I guess, historically and then going forward, where do you think there's opportunities for additional technology to make this a more efficient place?
I'll relate just one anecdote, and I can't remember who the senator was, but it might have been Russell Long who had opposed televising the Senate, and finally they did, and on his way out the door, he conceded or consented to allowing them to televise the Senate. But I think he was the one that was asked, well, what technology do you think has most changed the institution of Congress? And they expected him to say, well, television, of course. No, it was air conditioning, because then members would stay here and be working through the summer, and a lot of members wanted to be home with their families over the summer. But anyway.
He also said airplane changed it a lot because it enabled members to go back and forth easily, and the expectation developed that you're supposed to be back home, at least 3 or 4 days a week.
Technology is actually, I think, one of the great things of advanced democracy because it allows you to communicate with a lot of people. As we mentioned, you have a huge district now. If James Madison had his way, what would have been a constitutional amendment that passed had limited to 50,000 people per constituency, which would have been, about 6,000 members of Congress or so right now. But even then, he recognized it was going to be a problem. So the good thing about technology, it allows you to communicate a lot. I mean, one of the reasons, though, Strom Thurmond was effective at casework is because he's a legislator. And the bureaucrats realized that if they didn't help his constituents when he sent a case over, he was going to punish them in the authorization process by hitting their program, or maybe even calling a director of a program who wasn't responsive to their constituents' needs. So the fact that you can legislate and hold the executive branch accountable strengthens your ability to do good casework. I think the one problem about technology is that we're substituting for communication for legislating. And so we're great at communicating. In fact, if you notice our staff shrink, we have fewer legislative people and more communication people because they're communicating a message. It would be better if we were actually producing a product that we're communicating about instead of messages that we're communicating about. So I still think the technology will be better, and 10 years from now we're going to be using a technology we haven't even heard of yet. But unless we fix the problem about not legislating, we're just going to communicate more efficiently the fact that we're sending out messages and not the legislation we do. You still have to fix, I think technology is great, but we still have to fix the underlying problem, which is that we have to actually start legislating again in the Congress.
Any areas going forward that you think technology would be useful? For example, electronic voting in committees. I had a 90-minute vote the other day in Education and Labor, and I knew the outcome of every vote before we even started. And it was a little bit frustrating. But any other ideas where technology could be applied?
I think one thing that you want to avoid, there was actually a members' day in the Rules Committee a few years back when one of the members testifying suggested that, and this was a California member, and I can understand the frustrations of having to fly all the way across the country to get back to work on a Monday evening, but the member suggested that they be allowed to do electronic voting from their district offices for the House floor. And that just destroys the whole idea of a collective activity that you're supposed to be participating in that flows from a debate on a particular bill or amendment or whatever. So, you know, I wouldn't get too fancy or cute with the technology, and then let's not go down the route of having members voting from their district offices.
And so one other thing, if you had one change you could fix, I would upgrade your constituent management software systems, which are kind of prehistoric. I mean, Congress just isn't a big enough market to get paid attention to, but it's way beyond, I mean, what the private sector has. I mean, you should have sophisticated computer programs that allow you to have a profile for your constituents so you know who you've done a case for and who's written to you on what subjects and who's met with you. We need a more sophisticated system, and right now the current system doesn't really allow the resources to do that.
Sure, thank you. And the other issue I wanted to touch on is scheduling. So many of us serve on 2, 3, even 4 different committees, subcommittees, and we have meetings that, I mean, I had 1 hour last week where I was supposed to be in 3 different places at once, and it was really challenging. So my question is, this is not new. Have there been any historical attempts to address this? Number one. Then number two, do you have any thoughts on how we could modify scheduling, both committees, subcommittees, and also floor votes? You know, the lack of predictability of floor votes makes it somewhat challenging as well. So just any thoughts you'll have on that?
As I recall, there was an attempt back in '65 to rationalize committee schedules, but it was really based on the assumption that you'd be here 5 days a week, so certain committees could only meet, you know, Tuesdays and Thursdays, others Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the more important ones, and then also sorting out the whole mess of subcommittees and so on. But that didn't really go anywhere, but it was something that was looked into.
Yeah, there was a committee that hasn't been mentioned called the Partisan Committee in 1980. They were not very successful, and what they were trying to do was to create a separate energy committee with all consolidated jurisdiction within it. It went down to defeat. But one of the challenges they took on was the same one that you mentioned, and this is another one that's always around, this conflict between many committees or subcommittees meeting at the same time. And they came up with a computerized schedule that maybe is even on the books in the House. I'd have even forgotten if anybody even follows it, and that's another factor, whether or not the chair actually follows the schedule, you know, and or disregards it, and there's no data on that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I know, Mr. Woodall, I can't give you 20 minutes, but I can, if you have some follow-up questions, I'm more than happy to yield to you for a couple.
I will limit it to 2, then,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, with that indulgence. If we stipulate that, I think one of the areas we'll find agreement is that the Congress needs to be able to push back against the White House. So expanding our committee resources so that we can do that. Not that the Gingrich administration went easy on the Clinton administration. We cut staff by 1/3. I still think we did a pretty good oversight job over those years. So more isn't necessarily better. But if we stipulate the committee is going to get larger, Is anybody going to defend the 18-person cap on a personal office? Institutionally, is there a reason why we want to limit personal office staff, but committee staff can be at whatever size the budget will allow?
So I will not defend the 18-person cap for institutional reasons, but I will ask you, where would you put them in your office space in Washington, D.C. if you hired more personal staff?
We told you about the new office building going up right outside here. That's coming to that next.
But part of the problem is that, well, how many offices can actually employ 18 people anymore, given the budget cuts and the MRA? This was a major reform in the past, was increasing the number of staff, because Congress didn't have any staff for the first 100 years. Then it had 1, and then it had 3, and then it had 10. And in the 70s, you came to 18 full-time staffers and 4 part-time. The problem is if you don't have the budget to do it, it doesn't work. Now, the Senate does it differently. They just get a payroll based on per capita income of their state. But I would like to see you get the budgets back to have so you can have full staffs, including the people necessary to actually have a robust legislative program.
And against that institutional question, Mark's talked about the authorization process and using that as a tool to push back against Article 2. But when we were in our Joint Select Committee on budget process, we were actually having the discussion about abolishing the authorization process. Why budget and authorize and appropriate? Everybody back home in the state is just doing it once instead of 3 times. I subscribe to what Mr. Strand says about using that as an additional tool to push back on Article 2. Is from your perspective, is there a institutional case to be made to abolish appropriation authorizations as opposed to enhance authorizations?
Well, we had one member, I think Congressman Bob Walker of Pennsylvania, who suggested getting rid of the Appropriations Committee and folding their functions into the authorizers. So I haven't heard that has grown any in terms of popularity, but it was a thought.
Well, the record on that is when they did it and they tried it in the early 1900s for a period of time, authorizing and appropriating together, and as people predicted when this happened, that it would lead to quite an escalation in terms of expenditures for the programs under that panel's jurisdiction. And so that was when Congress passed the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 that granted the president, gave the president the authority to create the budget and created, OMB, and also reconsolidated all these separate appropriation bills and the authorizing committees back into the appropriation committee, where they are to this day. And it says, I like the authorization process. I think it needs to be strengthened. It's one of that is the group that probably should be doing a lot more oversight. I mean, the appropriators do a tremendous, wonderful work, but to exactly drill down into these programs, that's the job of the authorizers and the subcommittees as well. And that, I think, will even help the appropriators to better understand or learn about what's happening with certain agencies, programs, whatever.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. And Ms. Brooks, you had a follow-up as well.
I apologize. I don't know if this was asked previously. I had to step out briefly, but one of the ideas that came from the member hearing, and I believe it was General Bergman from Michigan, who actually suggested, and people actually bring it up at home, the idea of changing our terms to 4 years. Has that ever actually been proposed? Has it ever been debated? So we just, lost an incredible senator in Birch Bayh who actually got 2 constitutional amendments passed in his time, in addition to Title IX. I mean, he did some really significant legislating, and I thought, and people at home sometimes say, you all just don't have long enough terms to get anything done. You're constantly running for office instead of legislating. And I'm like, right, what a ridiculous notion but I thought when Jack Bergman brought it up at the hearing, I thought, what do you think? It's kind of an interesting concept.
I like the idea, but I think LBJ proposed that back when he was president, that there be 4-year terms for House members, but he wanted them contemporaneous with the president's term, and obviously then the members would be more beholden to the president. So I think the other people have suggested you stagger them, so half the House would be elected during a presidential year, the other half, in what's now a midterm year. But
You know, when the Constitution was first written, the initial idea was you would have a 1-year term, because the theory was that the further you were away from election, the greater the likelihood for corruption. And so they compromised on a 2-year term. But I think in a modern context, there is not, that I am aware of, any legislature in the world that has 2-year terms, because you just realize you don't have that amount of time to develop expertise, and also just to survive the political blowback that you get when you actually deal with substantive issues and you float controversial issues out there. I think part of the problem in ratifying an amendment, which I suspect would pass the House of Representatives rather easily, would be that the guys over on the other side don't like the idea of House members having free rides to run against them, and that's always been raised as a problem in terms of ratification. But I think in the current context, with the size of districts, the fundraising issues, the complexities of the policies you have to deal with, the idea of a 2-year term is pretty hard to rationalize.
Let me add one point, and I agree with what John said. I mean, in good CRS fashion, pro and con. Now, to me, a fundamental con is that this is a big society with diverse interests, and the people ought to have an opportunity at least every 2 years to express their sentiment on the direction of the country and the policies being made. And that would be not possible with this 4-year term.
Yeah, I think the other choice of the Constitutional Convention besides the 1 year and 2 years was 6 months. So be grateful for little things. But I think the House is a majoritarian institution. It's supposed to reflect the will of the people. The Senate's supposed to be the other body that sort of tempers, as Washington put to Jefferson, the hot temperatures of the people, the hot arguments of the people. And so I think it's always going to be natural in a democracy that there has to be. I think it's what makes our democracy kind of unique compared to parliamentary systems, because the individual districts get to vote, and it's not a party list or something like that. And I'm not sure it's avoidable, although it certainly isn't. I certainly wouldn't want your job.
Thank you on that note. And I would say, but Chairman Kilmer and to the ranking member, I do think, not necessarily advocating for a 4-year term, but I do hope that this group thinks big and thinks somewhat out of the box on some big, makes some big recommendations and proposals. Yield back.
Thanks. Before I let you go, I want to ask if there is anything we should have asked you, any lessons learned, any guidance to us, or to Ms. Brooks's point, any out-of-the-box ideas you want to tee up for us before we thank you and adjourn. And I'll just run down the line. If you've said your piece, you can pass, and if you've got more you think you want to share, I'd welcome it.
I'll pass. Well, I think timing has passed. I've got a lot to say, but I'm passing.
Only one thing real quick, because I can't resist, is I do think you need to aim big. And the more you get your colleagues excited about different ideas, the more you're going to be able to do, especially on the modernization end, the capacity end. But if you can get them excited about the big ideas, that overcomes their objections of leadership, because leadership needs a rank-and-file support member. So the more buy-in you get, and I think you made a great start with the member session last time, thanks. I think the more successful this committee is going to be.
Thanks.
Yeah, and let me make one suggestion. We had, as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, a bipartisan commission on political reform at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and one of the recommendations, they made several recommendations that did not require rules changes, but how do you improve the culture of Congress so you get more things done? And one of their recommendations was that committee chairmen circulate the proposed committee mark on a piece of legislation in advance and then be willing to allow buy-in by the minority, and that way you're going to have much less disagreement when you come to the full committee markup on a bill. And I think that you cannot mandate that by a rule change, but I know that several, or not several, but I know at least one committee chairman that tried that in the past. I think it was the Science Committee, and got high praise for having such unanimity on the legislation that they were working on. So it doesn't require a rule change, but you have to think also in terms of encouraging some of these incremental cultural changes that can make a difference.
Very good. I want to thank all of our witnesses. I think this was a good and meaty couple hours, so thank you for your testimony. Without objection, all members will have 10 business days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their responses. And I ask our witnesses, to, if able, to please respond as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 10 business days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Why not? Why not? Well, that was good. I think.
That was, what's the name, Mark Gordon from Tennessee, when he was chair of the Science Committee.
Yeah.
He did that.
Yeah.